I'm just gonna start off broadcasts in the future with coughing, just because that obviously makes you lot feel much better about yourself. Anyway, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, boys and girls. How are we all doing today? Hmm. Oh yes, that's the wrong one. Hold on. Go, go. Oh, that's that's wrong. No, that's not wrong. That's right. Okay, good. Yes. So today we are very thankful to the Mommy Clique for sponsoring something that's at least mildly interesting and relevant to today's world. Ooh, actually, let me do this. Yes, I am saying that a lot of the stuff you in particular sponsor is not very interesting, especially your entire corporation. No, I'm standing by that. I am absolutely going to stand by that statement. Yes, so we are. What are we doing? We are reading. We're starting chapter 2, I believe. No, chapter 4. Oops. Yes, we're starting chapter 4, and we're going to, read as much as it takes us. Excellent. Okay. Oh, actually, one second. There we go. Okay. The position of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the money market. The Chancellor, a little bit of about the British system, right? The Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury. I think the Chancellor is the Second Lord of the Treasury, if I'm not mistaken. Let me just double check this. Chancellor of the Exchequer, which, of course, until recently was Rishi Sunak, who precipitated the fortunate the fortunate demise of our boy Bojo, our clown head Bojo. Second Lord of the Treasury. That's right. Yes. So the Prime Minister is the First Lord of the Treasury. The Chancellor is the second. Did my face die again? Yes, it did. That's all right. Let's do this. Let's that's not restart that. Okay. Is my face back? No, my face is not. Okay, there we go. So yes, of course. Second Lord of the Treasury. Let's say that was at first. 1 minute. Chancellor of the Exchequer is the second Lord of the Treasury. Essentially the person managing of the modern British. And so, why is it? That's a good question. One of our Year 1 students has asked, why is the Prime Minister the First Lord of the Treasury at 3 minutes? Why is the British PM the First Lord of the Treasury? So this is a bit historical. Because Britain evolved itself out of an absolute monarchy. Because Britain evolved itself out of an absolute monarchy for a while, right? So the it evolved in steps, right? In tiny little steps. Whoa, with the James, with our boy Henry. So like after every revolution, counter-revolution, after Cromwell, all of these things, more and more power was taken away from the crown and put into the government itself. And so for a while, I mean, most of the power that exists for governments is within the treasury itself, right? It is how to spend money. And so when that power was moved away from the monarch to the parliament, it essentially like to keep the monarch happy, right? Like the monarch, or I mean, ish, to keep that legitimacy going. The civilian leaders were designated lords of His Majesty, Her Majesty's treasury. And so they were in control of the money. So that's why the prime minister is the first lord of the treasury, because they were able to then determine where the money goes. Obviously, as Britain then moved towards ever. Oh, my face died again, didn't it? Oh no, it's fine. As Britain then moved towards more and more democracy, the prime minister obviously has more and more things that he or she is responsible for. Well, she in the case of Mrs. Thatcher, and now not Penny, what's her face? Truss. Miss Truss, Mrs. Truss, right? And so yes, 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 I've already assumed that Liz will be the next PM. I'm not sure. I don't have enough faith in the conservative party members to choose Rishi Sunak, and I don't think he's slated to win. Actually, let me double check. Rishi versus Liz. Blah 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 blah. I don't care about views, chances. Bets. Let's look at the odds. This is August 2nd. Oh, that's 20 days ago. No. Yeah. 20 days ago, 1 to 6, 2 to 9. Yeah, she's dramatically dramatically farther ahead. I still wish Penny. I think Penny would have been a better PM than this. Anyway, that's besides the point. So as the PM got more and more, as the First Lord of the Treasury got more and more other responsibilities, you have these other blah blah blah. Doesn't even. It doesn't even. Yes, exactly. 1 second. Okay. I'm going to pretend I didn't read that. The position of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the money markets, right? So we're reading Lombard Street, chapter 4. In my version, this is page 54. I don't know where each of your versions are. I mean, I did send each of you a copy of this, didn't I? Yes, we did. I remember. Each one of you got a copy of this. I mean, yes, essentially. Digital copy. I didn't. No, I never sent you a physical book. Actually, no, I might have sent a physical book to 50, 60, 100 of you, give or take. Because there were some people that asked me for a digital for a book, even though they could have just gone onto Amazon and bloody bought it themselves. But that's besides the point. What? Oh yes, anyway. Not important. Can we just get on with the reading, please? It's 8 minutes. Okay. Okay. Excuse me, no thank you. No, you may not. Okay. The position of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the money markets. I'm just gonna stop looking at chat and I'm gonna start reading, okay? Nothing can be truer in theory than the economical principle that banking is a trade and only a trade, and nothing can be more surely established by a larger experience than that a government which interferes with any trade injures that trade. Okay, nothing blah blah. Yes. The best thing undeniably that a government can do with the money market is to let it take care of itself. Remember, this was considered radical, right? Like this position on free markets and on and being against interventionism is actually the reason that Walter Bagehot formed his newspaper, which was, of course, The Economist. Essentially, he was of the opinion that free trade in its, at least free trade, if not capitalism, free trade was the underpinning was underpinning the might and the rise of the British Empire. The ability to trade, the ability to finance trade, was a power that was far, far above any other country at the time, and therefore meant that more and more countries would come to Britain and more money would flow into Britain to do this, right? And so he talked in the beginning of this book that we read, like a year ago. We must have read this almost a year ago. He talked in the beginning about the fact that at this time, when was this, 1860 something? That central banks were nowhere near as powerful as London and anywhere else in the world, including New York, Paris, and Berlin, which were sort of the big capitals that were competing with London, right? London was just by far the most successful city. Anyway. Right. But a government can only carry out this principle universally if it observes one condition. It must keep its own money. The government is necessarily at times possessed of large sums in cash. It is by far the richest corporation in the country. Its annual revenue payable in money far surpasses that of any other body or person. And if it begins to deposit this immense income as it accrues at any bank, at once it becomes interested in the welfare of that bank. It cannot pay the interest on its debt if that bank cannot produce the public deposits when that interest becomes due. It cannot pay its salaries and defray its miscellaneous expenses if that bank fail at any time. A modern government is like a very rich man with very great debts which he cannot well pay. Its credit is necessary to its prosperity, almost to its existence, and if its bankers fail when one of its debts become due, its difficulty is intense. Another banker, it will be said, may take up the government account. He may advance, as is so often done in other bank failures, what the government needs for the moment in order to secure the government account in future. But the imperfection of this remedy is that it fails in the very worst case. In a panic, and at a general collapse of credit, no such banker will probably be found. The old banker who possesses the government deposit cannot repay it, and no banker, not having that deposit, will, at a bad crisis, be able to find the 5 million or 6 million pounds which the quarter day of a government such as ours requires. Remember, right? Like, this was in 1860s. And that is what, the 5 million pounds. Today we're talking, trillions, billion. Well, I mean, not trillions. Couple hundred billion, hundreds of billions, 5 billion, 10 billion. I'm making up those numbers because I can't actually. Then no, we're not in trouble. If a finance minister, having entrusted his money to a bank, begins to act strictly and say he will in all cases let the money market take care of itself, the reply is that in one case, the money market will take care of him too, and he will be insolvent, right? So you cannot let the government money be mixed completely with private money, because in private hands, because when those banks fail, there's nothing you can do about it, especially in those days of quite often bank failures, right? Like, a lot of our modern banking system is built on the dust of what we're reading right now. I know most of you can't see it. I'm holding up the book and I'm pointing to it. Doesn't matter. Not important. What time is it? At 13 minutes. Most of the modern banking system is built on the ashes of these failures that Badgett is of. Coincidentally, failures that our crypto boys and girls are relearning at a rapid pace. Good way for value destruction. Yes, it is. Excellent. Excuse me. Okay. Yes. I'm shrinking it right now. Just relax. Anyway. Okay. what take it, what take it. In the infancy of banking, it is probably much better that a government should, as a rule, keep its own money. If there are not banks in which it can place secure reliance, it should not seem to rely on. Still, less should it give peculiar favor to anyone, and by entrusting it with the government account, secure to it a mischievous supremacy above all other banks. Remember, right? Because the government will always need money, the government will always have money. So essentially, if you give your money to a private bank, you are essentially saying that bank is cooler than the others. And we see that in Hong Kong. I can't remember the exact three, but it's HSBC, Stand Chart, and one of the others. I can't remember the other one. Not important. We see some of this in Hong Kong because those three banks are able to print money based on the authority of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, which tells them when to print and for how much, blah, blah, blah. Still, completely irrelevant to this case, actually. Still, less should it, blah, blah, blah. The skill of a financier in such an age is to equalize the receipt of taxation and the outgoing of expenditure. It should be a principal care with him to make sure that more should not be locked up at a particular moment in the government coffers than is usually locked up there. If the amount of debt capital so buried in the treasury does not at any time much exceed the common average, the evil so caused is inconsiderable. It is only the loss of interest on a certain sum of money, which would not be much of a burden on the whole nation. The additional taxation it will cause will be inconsiderable. Such an evil is nothing in comparison with that of losing the money necessary for the inevitable expense by entrusting it to a bad bank, or that of recovering this money by identifying the national credit with the bad bank and so propping it up and perpetuating it. Right? You're feeding bad people, and that's bad. No. Just no. Guys, stop. Stop. Okay? I mean it. Blah 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 da 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 da. Nothing, bad bank, perpetuating. So long as the security of the money market is not entirely to be relied on, the government of a country had much better leave it to itself and keep its own money. If the banks are bad, they will certainly continue bad and will probably become worse if the government sustains and encourages them. The cardinal maxim is that any aid to a present bad bank is the surest mode of preventing the establishment of a future good bank. Again, basically, if you bail something out, the bank will, continue its bad practices instead of doing good things. Obviously, we saw something similar in 2008 in the Great Financial Crisis, in the Great Recession that followed. Modern systems are a little bit different because modern banks are such big. Excuse me, come on, guys. Too many emails. Modern banks are such big behemoths that it is really, really different, right? Like, modern banks are needed to facilitate basically the same thing as the old banks do, but they do it with a lot more efficiency because banking is something that really, really depends on efficiency, right? Like, banks tend to, when banks are properly competing, their margins are tiny, right? And that's important. When banks are properly competitive, their margins are tiny, and thus they need a lot of extra. They need a big market to turn tiny margins into profit. And obviously, it also makes things easier because if you have a bank that's everywhere, you can always get your money from your ledger at that bank. Whereas if there were, there are regional banks, and then there are, in the US there are still regional banks. In a lot of the rest of the developed world, regional banking is not quite as in the US it's because there's a whole other issue. The point I'm laboriously trying to get to is, if there are many, many smaller banks that are very, very inefficient because they have to establish correspondence with everyone else, right? And that network becomes so heavy to maintain that it makes it very, very inconvenient for everyone. Does that kind of make sense? Because the network is think about it, to maintain the current efficiency that we have, each banking institution has to essentially establish a relationship with every other banking institution. That means that they can then send money back and forth really quickly and all of that. And so that means we're talking on the order of n to the n, right? So ish. Well, ish. Just basically somewhere around that complexity, and that's the same type of complexity we see in the brain. And so, or the more banks you have, the more complex it is, and the more impossible it is. And actually, that makes it more dangerous. 21 minutes, higher bank numbers and higher complexity makes the entire banking system more dangerous because there are more nooks for bad things to hide. Does that kind of make sense? Because the more complex something is, the more places it can go wrong. I think there's not really much else I can say about it. Yes. Oh, do I have to take this? No. No, I don't have to take this one. Okay. So we have what, another 10 minutes left? Yeah, let's. Yes, I know it took me 20 minutes to get past the first two pages, but that's fine. 30 minutes. When the trade of banking began to be better understood, when the banking system was thoroughly secure, the government might begin to lend gradually, especially to lend the unusually large sums which, even under the most equable system of finance, will at times accumulate in the public exchequer. Right? Under a natural system of banking, it would have every facility, where there are many banks keeping their own reserves, and each most anxious to keep a sufficient reserve because its own life and credit depended on it. The risk of the government in keeping a banker would be reduced to a minimum. It would have the choice of many bankers and would not be restricted to any one. Its course would be very simple and be analogous to that of other public bodies in the country. The Metropolitan Board of Works, which collects a greater revenue in London, has an account at the London and Westminster Bank, for which the bank makes a deposit of consols as security. Functions of blah blah, not that's the London County Council, which has continued the arrangement for the deposit, blah blah. Okay, not important. The Chancellor of the Exchequer would have no difficulty in getting such security either, if, as is likely, his account would be thought to be larger than any single bank ought to be entrusted with. The public deposits might be divided between several. Each would give security, and the whole public money would be safe. If at any time the floating money in the hands of government were exceptionally large, he might require augmented security to be lodged, and he might obtain an interest. He would be a lender of such magnitude and so much influence that he might command his own terms. He might get his account kept safe if anyone could. If, on the other hand, the Chancellor of the Exchequer were a borrower, as at times he is, as they are now constantly, he would have every facility in obtaining what he wants. The credit of the English government is so good that he could borrow better than anyone else in the world. He would have greater facility, indeed, than now, for, except with the leave of Parliament, the Chancellor of the Exchequer cannot borrow by our present laws in the open market. He can only borrow from the Bank of England on what are called deficiency bills. In a natural system, he would borrow of any one out of many competing banks, selecting the one that would lend cheapest, but under our present artificial system, he is confined to a single bank, which can fix its own charge. It sounds nice, doesn't it? Being able to borrow at, ridiculously low interest rates, blah, 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 blah. But there are problems with that, right? Because essentially, we'll get into it, obviously. But with governments, if they borrow from the public markets, it tends to drain money out, right? Which is why the treasuries can buy government bills and drain money out of the system. It's essentially the same thing. Excuse me. Let me reverse that. which is why the Fed can buy treasuries on the open system, thus increasing demand for the treasuries and therefore allowing the government to borrow more. Anyway, that's completely irrelevant to our current discussions. If, contrary to expectation, a collapse occurred, the government might withdraw, as the American government actually has withdrawn its balance from the bankers. It might give its aid, lend exchequer bills, or otherwise pledge its credit for the moment, but when the exigency has passed, it might let the offending banks suffer. There would be a penalty for their misconduct. New and better banks who might take warning from that misconduct would arise. As in all natural traits, what is old and rotten would perish, and what is new and good would replace it. Until the new banks had proved by good conduct their fitness for state confidence, the state need not give it. The government could use its favor as a bounty on prudence, and the withdrawal of that favor as a punishment for culpable folly. Under a good system of banking, a great collapse, except from rebellion or invasion, will probably not happen. A large number of banks, each feeling that their credit was at stake in keeping a good reserve, probably would keep one. If anyone did not, it would be criticized constantly and would soon lose its standing and in the end disappear. Free markets, right? And such banks would meet an incipient panic freely and generously. They would advance out of their reserve boldly and largely. For each individual bank would fear suspicion and know that at such periods it must show strength, if at such time it wishes to be thought to have strength. Such a system reduces to a minimum the risk that is caused by the deposit. If the national money can be safely deposited in banks in any way, this is the way to make it safe. But this system is nearly the opposite to that which the law and circumstances have created for us in England. The English government, far from keeping cash from the money market till the position of that market was reasonably secure, at a very early moment, and while credit of all kinds was most insecure for its own interests, entered into the money market. In order to effect loans better, it gave the custody and profit of its own money, along with other privileges, to a single bank, and therefore practically and in fact it is identified with the bank of this hour. It cannot let the money market take care of itself because it has deposited much money in that market, and it cannot pay its way if it loses that money. Nor would any English statesman propose to wind up the Bank of England. A theorist might put such a suggestion on paper, but no responsible government would think of it. I'm just gonna ignore chat. I'm just gonna ignore all of you. At the thanks, but no thanks. At the worst crisis and in the worst misconduct of the bank, no such plea has been thought of. In 1825, when it still was empty. In 1837, when it had to ask aid from the Bank of France, no such idea was suggested. By irresistible tradition, the English government was obliged to deposit its money in the money market and to deposit with this particular bank. And this system has plain and grave evils. First, because being created by state aid, it is more likely than a natural system to require state help. Secondly, because being a one reserve system, it reduces the spare cash of the money market to a smaller amount than any other system, and so makes the money market more delicate. There being a less hoard to meet liabilities, any error in the management of that reserve has a proportionately greater effect. Third, because our one reserve is, by the necessity of its nature, given over to one board of directors, were therefore dependent on the wisdom of that one only, and cannot, as in most trades, strike an average of the wisdom and the folly, the discretion and the indiscretion of many competitors. Lastly, because that board of directors is, like every other board, pressed on by its shareholders to make a high dividend, and therefore to keep a small reserve, whereas the public interest imperatively requires that they shall keep a large one. These four evils were inseparable from the system, but there is besides an additional and accidental evil. The English government not only created this singular system, but proceeded to impair it and demoralize all the public opinion respecting it. For more than a century after its creation, notwithstanding occasional errors, the Bank of England, in the main, acted with judgment and with caution. Its business was but small, as we should not reckon, but for the most part it conducted that business with prudence and discretion. In 1696 it had been involved in the most serious difficulties and had been obliged to refuse to pay some of its notes. For a long period it was in wholesome dread of public opinion, and the necessity of retaining public confidence made it cautious. But the English government removed that necessity. In 1797, Mr. Pitt feared that he might not be able to obtain sufficient specie for foreign payments in consequence of the low state of the bank reserve, and he therefore required the bank not to pay in cash. He removed the preservative apprehension, which is the best security of all banks. For this reason, the period under which the Bank of England did not pay gold for its notes, the period from 1797 to 1819, is always called the period of bank restriction. As the bank during that period did not perform and was not compelled by law to perform its contract of paying its notes in cash, it might apparently have been well called the period of bank license. Timing 30 minutes, we have to go. But the word restriction was quite right, and was only proper word as a description of the policy of 1797. Mr. Pitt did not say that the Bank of England need not pay its notes in specie. He restricted them from doing so. He said that they must not. We will... These are evils. We'll talk about the benefits in the future. Anyway. You lot are just the worst. Can I just put that out there? You people are... 31 to the... Is it one particular corporation or is it... No, I'm seeing boys from a whole bunch of corporations. Actually, I know what to call you guys. I'll call you to the Annoy Muses colleague. You lot are the worst. This well, no, not clique. We'll call it a super clique. Super clique. Many because it's lucky that our year one students were in a completely different channel. Otherwise, they would have been overwhelmed by this this meme spam. Okay, you guys are like 40, 50 years old. Why are you spamming memes? Can you guys just be a little bit more mature? Set some nice examples. No, of course you're not going to. I know. Can you even set examples? That's not what I said. That's what one of our year one. Year one. Oh, I'm gonna put a spin on that. Can you even set examples, bro? Anyway, we are done for today. You lot are... Some of you are terrible. Some of you are amazing. Thank you to our mommy clique for sponsoring this. I'm not sure about what else we need to talk about. No, we're good for today. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. In conclusion, please please download Firefox. Please don't do Chrome. And I shall see all of you guys tomorrow when we will be doing Persona 5 Strikers. And that's it for today.